So one of the first things to say about Henry V is that his story is so bound up with Shakespeare's play, Henry V. And he also appears in the earlier plays of Henry IV with Falstaff and all that sort of thing. But in the play, Henry V, it's so sort of famous, especially to sort of the English or British mind, that it's difficult to separate fact from fiction. Of course, here in my story, as your friendly neighbourhood history bro, as your humble narrator, I shall be talking about the real history, of course. But here or there, I might actually quote from the Bard. In fact, I'll start by quoting from the opening of the play, Henry V, and it gives you a sense of that feeling for sort of how great the story is. So the chorus, the narrator for Shakespeare's play, opens by saying this: "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the greatest heaven of invention," i.e., I'm going to tell your story, but you're going to need to use your imagination. "A kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene," i.e., we almost need actual kings to play the parts in this play. That's how great it is. "Then should warlike Harry," that's the king, Henry V, "warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars," Mars, the god of war. He has become the god of war. "And at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. But pardon gentles all, the flat unraised spirit that hath dared on this unworthy scaffold," this unworthy scaffold, we're not worthy, "to bring forth so great an object. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France, or may we cram within this wooden O," the Globe Theatre on the South Bank in London, "the very casks that did affright the air of Agincourt? Oh, pardon, since a crooked figure may attest in little place a million, and let us, ciphers of this great account, on your imaginary forces work." Again, you have to use your imagination quite often. "Suppose within the girdle of these walls are now confined two mighty monarchies, whose high upreared and abutted fronts the perilous narrow ocean parts asunder. Piece out our interfections with your thoughts. Within 1,000 parts divide one man, and make imaginary pruescence. Think when we talk of horses, that you see their printing their proud hoofs in the receiving earth. For it is your thoughts that now must deck out kings. Carry them here and there, jumping over times, turning the accomplishments of many years into an hourglass. For the which supply, admit me chorus to this history, who, prologue like, your humble patience, pray gentle to hear, kindly to judge our play." End quote. Okay, before I get stuck into the early life of Henry, this will have to be more than one episode, of course, just to mention some of the sources, because we actually know quite a bit about the life and times of Henry V. He's sort of, it's fair to say, truly in the light of history. For earlier kings, for William the Conqueror, for example, we know relatively little. There's the pinprick of light shines upon his age, and we get small scenes here and there, and the rest is all darkness. But by the early 15th century, we have a fair bit. It's not quite in the full light of history, I would say. It's not like the 17th century, where we've got lots of letters and journals and accounts from both sides all over the place, an embarrassment of riches. It's not quite that, but we do have a fair bit. For example, the rolls, the royal rolls, all the accounting. We know how a lot of money was spent, down to the penny or fraction of a penny often. And you can reconstruct or infer loads from that. But we also have a number of histories. There are two histories written in the 1430s. One is the Vita et Gesta Henrici Quinti, the life and deeds of Henry V, often known as the Pseudo Elmham, because it was thought it might have been written by Thomas Elmham, a monk of St Augustine's Abbey in Canterbury, that appears to draw on information from the Lord Walter Hungerford, who was actually around at the time. So a good source, really. The other one is the Vita Henrici Quinti, the life of Henry V, which draws upon Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who was one of Henry's younger brothers. There's also the first English life of King Henry V, written a bit later in the very, very early 16th century. There's the Tudor chronicler Edward Hall, who wrote the union of the two illustrious families of Lancaster and York. And then there's Holinshed's Chronicles, which is a collaborative work, and that seems, scholars have decided that Shakespeare probably drew heavily from Holinshed. And then there are other bits and bobs here and there, some French accounts and things. But it is a truly great story. Most historians, until very recently, thought of Henry V as possibly our greatest king. In terms of martial prowess, he's certainly one of the greatest, up there with Edward I or Edward III. Even K.B. Macfarlane, a very eminent historian, who was not known for his breathless admiration of monarchs, said that all round, Henry V was, I think, the greatest man that ever ruled England. So let's just jump straight in then to the earliest portions of Henry's life. I shall have to go back over some of the ground I did in the last episode. There was a reason why the episode I did on Henry IV was pretty much an overview, because a lot of it, most of it, the last years of it, I'm going to go over again in a lot more detail here, but from the perspective of the young Henry. So let's try and get into his head. Let's try and find out what kind of person he was, or what his formative years were like, the world in which he was born and grew up in. So the first thing to say is that he is a member of the royal family, a senior member, but definitely not, absolutely not, in the line of succession. He was never meant to be king. There were many people ahead of him. So, you know, how does that happen? How did that come about, that he does in fact become king? So everyone knows what it's like when you're a child and you realise your sort of position in the world, when you realise your social standing. I mean, I, for myself, you know, when I was under 10, realised that I was born into a poor working class family. We weren't exactly dirt poor, never went hungry or shoeless, but had no money and certainly didn't own any land, no titles, not even close, but had sort of literary pretensions, and me and my siblings were expected to go to university, and then we'd have to work really hard for the rest of our lives to make ends meet. That's my lot in life. That was the hand I was dealt at birth. So for Henry V, you would have been told as a small child that your great-grandfather, who's now dead, used to be the king, a great king, Edward III, who ruled for a very long time and was hugely successful, the most successful king in a long time, had smashed the French up many times in France. And so this great shining king was your great-grandfather. And now your uncle is the king, that is Richard II. And your father is his cousin, they're about the same age. And your grandfather is John of Gaunt, who at the time was one of, arguably at certain points, the most powerful man in the country, more powerful than the king sometimes at various points. So you're a senior member of the royal family, very important, but nowhere near the throne itself. But your uncle is king and your father is the Duke of Lancaster, the Earl of Derby, one of the most important lords or earls or dukes in the whole country, and you're his eldest son. So you're absolutely right at the pinnacle of society, but not in line to the throne, expected to inherit great things. You will become, when you grow up, one of the richest and most important men in the country. Your uncle is king and your grandfather is super, super powerful, but sometimes out of favour. Your grandfather is walking a tightrope, a political tightrope, and your father himself has to sort of keep his head down and play the game and be a good boy. But the king himself has got all sorts of political troubles and even views many of his closest men, including your own father and grandfather, as enemies sometimes, certainly people to be wary of. Okay, so today I'm going to read from Anne Curry, historian Anne Curry, who I think does the best job of painting the picture of the early life, the childhood of Henry V. So I'll be reading from her, and her book is actually called Henry V, Playboy Prince to Warrior King. So before I actually start reading, just to mention again, there's this idea that Shakespeare plays up, which most historians think now isn't really all that accurate, that when Henry was young, or before he actually became king, he was, something like a playboy, that he slept around, that he drank wildly, that he had very bawdy friends, like John Falstaff, and that he was carefree and a bit of a tearaway, but that once he became king, he put all those childish things aside and became super serious, super pious, and super warlike, a dread sovereign. Well, we now think that that's just not true. It's not really particularly accurate. He was always a very serious sort of person, had no real choice. The maelstrom that he was thrown into meant that he had to grow up very, very quickly. I mean, by the time he's 12 or 13, he's he is involved in things. By the time he's 15 or 16, certainly involved in things. Okay, so Anne Curry says this, quote, according to an astrological treatise written during his own reign, Henry V, or as he was then known, the young Lord Henry, came into the world at 11:22 a.m. on the morning of the 16th of September 1386, born in a tower above the gatehouse of Monmouth Castle in the Welsh Marches. Later historians, misreading a financial record, gave him a fictitious, short-lived elder brother, but there is no doubt that he was in fact the firstborn of 6 to Henry Bolingbroke, Earl of Derby, who at that point can have little idea of the path that would lead him to ascend the English throne as King Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king, and his wife, Mary de Bohun, then some 16 or 17 years old. So one of the first things to say there, Henry had 3 other brothers, so there's these 4 boys. His younger brothers are Thomas, Duke of Clarence, John, the Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, each of which become important and play their role, some of them after Henry himself is dead. But okay, so remember, Clarence, Bedford, and Gloucester, they're his younger brothers. Usually it's a problem to have so many princes like that they would vie for power and undermine each other and even kill each other and things. In the Wars of the Roses, in the next generation, we'll see exactly that sort of thing play out. But here, although they don't always entirely get on and see eye to eye exactly, the three younger brothers do all look up to Henry ultimately and do as he asks, certainly by the time he actually becomes king. So bear that in mind. They don't turn on each other. So that's lucky. A bit like Hannibal and the Lion's Brood, all the brothers do work more or less essentially in unison. Okay, Curry goes on. Henry V's birthplace was owned by his grandfather, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the third surviving son of King Edward III, and a major political force in the reign of Richard II. Monmouth was among the many lands and castles which had come to Gaunt thanks to his marriage to Blanche, heiress of the great earldom and subsequently duchy of Lancaster. As Gaunt's first grandson, Henry was the heir presumptive to this great duchy, the largest and most valuable land holding in England other than that of the Crown, with major holdings in Lancashire and the Midlands, but tentacles in East Anglia, South Wales, and the Welsh Marches or the borderlands. An inheritance from his maternal ancestors could also be expected. Henry's mother was co-heiress with her sister, Eleanor, of their father, Humphrey de Bohun, Earl of Hereford and Essex, and the expectation was that their inheritance would be divided between their families. This prompted Richard II's granting of the title of Duke of Hereford to Bolingbroke, that's our Henry's father, of course, another title his eldest son would expect to inherit. So, as I said, not just a senior member of the royal family, but arguably his line, the most powerful, richest ones, but definitely not in the direct line of succession. Ahead of young Lord Henry, then, was a path that would lead him to becoming one of England's highest-ranking noblemen. As a member of a collateral line of the royal family, it was likely that at the age of majority, 21, when you're a child, it said that you're in your minority. Once you become a man, legally, you're in your majority. So bear that in mind. So at the age of majority, 21, or at marriage, he would have been given a title and a landed endowment, even in advance of coming into his full inheritance of the duchies of Lancaster and Hereford. As a peer of the realm, he would have been summoned to Parliament and involved in national and local politics and governance. He would have served in royal armies and embassies, and perhaps, following in his father's footsteps, participated in crusade. What we can glean of Henry's childhood from the financial records of his father and grandfather reveals an upbringing commensurate with his future prospects. The earliest known is the purchase of baby clothing, a demi-gown, for him at the age of 1. So these are details we just don't get in centuries before this. Again, we're emerging into the full light of history here. As was customary, he spent the first 5 years of his life with his mother, but he also had a wet nurse, Joan Wirren, whom he remembered when he became king, giving her a generous annuity. Like all aristocratic families, Lord Henry and his relatives and servants moved frequently between their various houses and estates. During his early years, we find him with his maternal grandmother, Joan Fitzalan, Countess of Hereford, at her house at Bitham in Lincolnshire, as well as frequenting his paternal grandfather's castles at Leicester and Kenilworth, which came to be one of his favourite places. As king, he would return there often, even building a special retreat for himself in its grounds. 7 books of Latin grammar bound together were brought for him in London when he was 8 years old, around the age at which his formal education would have begun. Later evidence indicates that Henry had a good knowledge of Latin and was conversant in French. Indeed, he appears a relatively bookish king, although the story that he attended Queen's College, Oxford in 1398 is apocryphal. So again, the picture is of a serious, more of a serious boy, rather than this runaway, tearaway, uncontrollable, libertine, drunkard, womanizer. The evidence isn't really there for that, to be perfectly honest. Other purchases of the 1390s reveal different aspects of a noble upbringing as he moved towards his teens: swords, saddles, and armour, a chain for his greyhounds, and the assigning of a group of several to his care and tutelage, which included Peter de Melbourne, a highly trusted life retainer of both Gaunt and his son. So once again, the details of the records go down to even the buying of a chain to chain up some greyhounds. Remarkable detail for, 600 plus years ago. In August 1396, shortly before his 10th birthday, the purchase of saddles with silver gilt fittings, quote, for the journey to Calais, quote, reveals that he had crossed the Dover Strait to attend the marriage of England's king, Richard II, to Isabella, 7-year-old daughter of King Charles VI of France, a union which was intended to cement a 30-year truce with France and facilitate the negotiation of a full peace.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.